Hey, welcome back to my channel, welcome back to Abatum. I hope you guys are doing well. To be honest, this is actually going to be a lengthy video, so if you've got time and you've got patience, I suggest you get a cup of tea, coffee, a little juice, something to just keep you going while we get through this video, because as you can imagine, this journey for me was definitely not something that happened overnight, and what I'm going to be talking to you about, I would say, happened over the period of the space of like 3 to 4 years, because really the catalyst of it was during the COVID period, which is obviously 2020, and now we're in 2024, so about 3 years. So bear with me, and I hope that you guys will be open as I share my testimony with you, so to speak. One thing I want to say, like a little disclaimer, is that what's my disclaimer? What is my disclaimer? So my little disclaimer is that watch this video with an open heart and mind, because a lot of the things that I'm going to say are going to be really challenging for some people to accept, and also I guess to pray, especially if you feel challenged by some of the things that I say. And the reason why I say that is because regardless of the fact that I don't subscribe, or I don't refer to myself as a Christian anymore, I still believe in prayer, knowing that prayer is very important. And so when you're watching this video, before, during, after, pray about it and ask the Spirit of the Most High to really reveal or expose some of the things that I'm talking about, because it's deeper than just feelings. It's deeper than just... Anyway, let's just get into it, because we'll be here all day. So anyway, before I get into the crux of the video, I just wanted to briefly touch on my journey into Christianity in the first place, how I became a Christian in the first place. So anyway, my family are, I would refer to them as like Catholics, I guess, because my grandma was a Catholic, and essentially that's what most people kind of ascribe to. And as I was growing up, we went to Catholic church, and it wasn't something that I would say was really embedded into us. We did go like maybe every Sunday. My brothers were kind of like involved in the altar work, but it wasn't something that I would say really dictated how we lived our lives. It was kind of just like, okay, cool, we're Christians, Catholics, and we go to church on Sunday, and that was about it. So as I was growing up, especially in my younger years, I would say between the ages of 11 and 13, there was like a big group of youth within the Catholic Church that I grew up in, and it was also connected to my primary school. So the children or my friends that were in primary school also went to my church, if that makes sense. So it was kind of like a little community, a little youth group that everyone was involved in. When I was 13, I was dedicated in the Catholic Church, and I would say not long after that, maybe within a year of me being dedicated, I stopped going to church, because I just felt like I don't really believe in this. It doesn't really resonate with me. I just found it really like detached, and just really, it just wasn't for me. And you know when you get to that age where you don't need to go anymore, I just stopped going. I was like, yeah, Mum, I'm not really feeling it. I'm just not gonna go. But yeah, so kind of, I'm just gonna go over this bit really, really quickly. But essentially, I got into a relationship really quite young. I think I was about 14. I met him when I was 13, and I think we started seeing each other properly between the ages of 14 and 15, roughly. And I was basically in this relationship for about 6 to 7 years. During that time, I had been brought into another type of church, which would be known as like a Pentecostal church, by another friend. And that was something that I kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? I basically subscribed to. This is something that I kind of allowed to supersede my previous beliefs in Catholicism, so to speak. But it wasn't something that I really embodied in terms of how I was living my life, because as I said, I was in this relationship, and when you go into that Pentecostal Christianity, there's more of a challenge in your personal life, and, you know, being able to, you know, live according to the Bible, if that makes sense. I feel like when you're a Catholic, you kind of go to church on Sunday, but everybody just does what they want. I remember very vividly that in my grandma's church, because we went to different churches, her priest was a heavy smoker and drinker. And so sometimes he would come to church, he would be drunk out of his head, or he would come out of the service and he would be smoking like packets of cigarettes. And so it wasn't something to me that I ever saw as serious, if that makes sense. But when I transitioned into Pentecostalism, as I said, it was something that was more of a challenge to your day-to-day living. It wasn't something that you could kind of be contradictory about. I'm not saying that, you know, people don't live essentially contradictory in Pentecostal churches, but I'm saying there's more of a challenge, if you get what I mean. So anyway, I subscribed to Pentecostalism, but it didn't change me enough to want to let go of this relationship. And so I was in it. Fast forward a couple of years, I ended up getting pregnant at the age of 19. I believed that I would marry the father of my child, and so even though I was like not prepared to be a mother at that time, and I wasn't really prepared for what I was stepping into, it was kind of like, okay, cool, I'm not on my own, we will kind of ride it out, make it work. It didn't work. And just that realization that my relationship had fallen apart really knocked me for six, because as I was growing up, I saw basically what my mum went through as a single parent, and I always said to myself that I would never be a single parent, if that makes sense. And so the fact that I found myself in that position really young, it really triggered me, and it hit me in a way that I don't think I was able to articulate at the time. Now when I look back, you know, through an older, you know, wiser lens, I was probably going through like postnatal depression, but just didn't know how to articulate it. And it affected me really badly, to the point where I didn't feel like I had a close enough connection to my son at the time, and it led me into like drinking alcohol consistently in order to kind of get away from the emotions I was feeling, I guess, about the whole situation. I was raving all the time, I was going out all the time, and yeah, my life just really took a downward spiral, to be honest. I was doing things that as a person I never saw myself doing, because I just wasn't involved in that sort of lifestyle. Anyway, fast forward again, I was invited to another church, Pentecostal church, by my friend, and I started going there, you know, kind of on and off for a little while. Went through a bit of a rocky patch, and then when I kind of came back, I made up my mind from that point that I was going to live for God with everything I had in me because of what I had gone through. I know I've rounded it up really quickly, that's because we've got a lot to go through. But it was so difficult for me those years, especially after I had my son, that I was like, if I can make this much mess of my life in such a short space of time, I need to be guided. Do you get what I mean? So it was like, okay, cool, I'm in this now, and I'm gonna go for it with everything I have in me, like literally everything. And that's what I did. I would say, you know, the term that we use is, you know, give your life to Christ. And so I gave my life to Christ at the age of 20, just before I turned 21, and I was devout. I would describe myself as dedicated. I'm trying to think of words, but I can't. But I was in it. I was literally in it. Like, there was nothing at the time that I believed could take me outside of it. I had literally pledged my allegiance to it in such a way that it didn't matter who or what, you know, challenged me in that aspect. I was fixed. So I would say even to the point where I began to isolate my family and friends. And this is something that at the time I knew was happening, but I just saw it as, you know, that's just a part and parcel of you, you know, being a soldier for Christ, so to speak. You know, family and friends don't understand, you know, let them drop off. If friends don't understand, let them drop off. This is about me and my relationship with Jesus. And so, you know, I fell out, you know, with one of my best friends that I'd been, you know, close to for years. You know, I started to fall away from like other friends. Basically, all the friends that I'd brought to church with me that didn't stick, I kind of just let them go. And it was kind of similar to, you know, how I dealt with my family. It wasn't intentional, but it's just how it is, just how the setup is. It was like whoever wasn't on it was just kind of forgotten. But anyway, fast forward again, 2014, I got married, and at this point, I'd already gone through a couple of things that had really, really knocked knocked my self-esteem for six. At the time I got married, I would say I had very low self-esteem. I had a very low sense of worth. And in all honesty, I knew at the time that the relationship or the marriage that I was stepping into wasn't right for me. But because I had been convinced, not just by, you know, the words of other people and, you know, by the stigmas that had been attached to me even before I came into the church, but I felt like they were almost solidified there, where I felt like, you know, as a single parent or a mum with a child, I was less valuable than the other women that were in the church. And I internalized that. I just didn't vocalize it. And so I'd gone through a period where maybe guys would approach me and, you know, ask to date me or whatever, and I would turn them down. And I would get this like, oh, you know, you can't keep turning down, you know, guys because of your position sort of thing. That was the kind of messaging that I would get. Even if it wasn't intentional, that's how I received it. And so it got to the point where I'm starting to see, you know, people get married. I'm starting to see people, you know, get into these relationships. And I started to feel like, oh my gosh, if I don't settle down quickly, then I'm going to be left on the shelf. I had very little understanding about who I was as a person or how much value I carried with or without a relationship. So I stepped into this marriage 2014, and to say the least, it didn't go very well from the very beginning. And I don't think it was very visible from the offset. I guess to most people, we probably seemed like a normal couple, thriving couple, so to speak. But the cracks were cracking from early. But again, because of my devotion to, you know, the word, my devotion to the gospel, if I had followed my intuition and, you know, followed my instincts, first of all, I wouldn't have got into that relationship. I wouldn't have even stepped into the marriage. But even after the cracks started to show very early on, I would have left if I had that self-esteem. If I had the self-esteem that I did now, if I had that value and that self-worth that I had now, I would have left within 3 months of that marriage beginning. I would have ended it. But again, like I said, I had low self-esteem, I had low self-worth. And because of my dedication to what I believed was the gospel and what I believed was the truth, I was like, okay, cool, I'm in this now. And I promise to be in this marriage until death do us part. So no matter what happens in this marriage, whatever happens in this relationship, I'm going to ride it out. The issue with this belief, or the issue with this sort of messaging or this internalization, is that when you are coupled with somebody who doesn't have that same energy that you do for the marriage, or doesn't have that same energy or dedication to the same gospel that you're kind of enveloped in, it opens the door for abuse. Let me just put it candidly. It opens the door for abuse, because you are essentially devoted to somebody who's not devoted to you in the same way, but they're going to use your devotion to do whatever it is that they want to do, knowing that you will tolerate it. And that's essentially what I was going through for like the whole time I was married. Fast forward again. I started my YouTube channel and when I first started my channel, I was talking about beauty, fashion, because I was working in the fashion industry, and that was mainly what my channel was about. And then after I had my daughter, that's when my skin health just went crazy. Again, we could probably cover this in another video. I can't go into like massive amounts of detail with every point because we'll literally be here all day. But that's when I started sharing my health journey on my channel and, you know, what was going on with my skin. There was a lot going on that I didn't speak about. Again, this was like in relation to my marriage. And, you know, it became apparent to me much later on that a lot of the things that I was dealing with internally was what was showing up externally on my skin. And again, I'm telling you, we'll go deep into this in other videos and it will make sense. And I'm pretty sure that, you know, as people are listening to me speak, especially like women that are in abusive marriages or relationships, you would probably relate to this when I say that the things that you go through in your marriage or your relationship, even though they're secret, in a sense that many people or most people don't know what's going on, it will always show up. Whether it takes a month, a year, 3 years, 5 years, it will always show up in you physically, always. And this is something that I think is really important for me to share, because there are probably billions of women across the globe that are dealing with all sorts of like autoimmune conditions, you know, hair loss, fertility issues, all sorts of conditions that are just unexplained, come out of nowhere, thyroid conditions, and these are all things that I was even diagnosed with, prior to me getting into my marriage, but worsened whilst I was in it. But anyway, so I was going through this whole skin issue, and that's when I started really documenting my health journey on my channel. In that space of time, my father-in-law at the time also passed away, and that really spurred me on to like really dig into the healthcare industry and what the healthcare industry was really about. Because in addition to that, like I said in the previous video, my son was also going through his own issues of health with regards to epilepsy and seizures, which were happening consistently. So I was doing all of these different lines of research to try and find out like what can be done. And the more I went to these hospital appointments and spoke to doctors and different health professionals, I realized that they had no idea what they were doing. And everything that we were going through or facing health-wise was prescribed with a drug or some sort of medication, but they never got to the root cause of why things were actually happening. And that's where my rabbit hole started. So digging deep into the healthcare industry, I started to realize that it was essentially a business. The healthcare industry in the Western world is essentially a business, and it's been set up in such a way that you're not meant to be healed. Because if they actually healed people or they actually relieved people of the things they were going through, the money funnel would stop. They wouldn't make money. And so it's not a profitable business. Whenever we think about, systems or, processes that are in place, I think it's really important to go back to the inception or the beginning of some of these things to truly understand, what they are, what they truly are, and what they're founded on. And so I'm just going to take a side note on this. And this became, the standard, the norm of the Western world, and eventually the indigenous world, where anybody who was practicing medicine using natural and holistic practices was demonized. And if you were prescribing people the way they had taught you to prescribe medicine, in their schools, then you were qualified. And this is exactly how it is today. It's a business. It's a business. No matter how you look at it, again, I'll put links, videos and research in the description, but it's a business. And like any business, if you don't have customers, you don't make money. If you don't have sick people, you don't make money. And so the system can never be set up to heal people, because if people know how to heal themselves inherently, or they know that their bodies were created to heal themselves, then they wouldn't make anything from you. And this exact principle and this exact framework is what translates into the framework of religion and religious practices that are practiced all over the world today. There's absolutely no difference. So when people ask me how are these two things related? How is health and spirituality related? It's related not just because there are 3 elements to you as a human body or as a human person. You have, like I said, your body, your physical body, your spiritual body, and your soul, which is your consciousness. But it's relative because the system of colonization or the systems of domination are exactly the same. In order for you to be dominated in such a way, you would have to lose knowledge of self. Anywho, so fast forward again, after doing all this research for myself, I was able to heal my son naturally, knowing what sort of foods that he shouldn't be eating to trigger his epileptic, or should I say his seizures. He was diagnosed with an early onset of epilepsy, but the doctors at the time told me that if he was to go on epilepsy medication, that he would essentially have to stay on them for life. And so that was 100% not something I was willing to do. But my son has not had a seizure since he was about 3 or 4 years old. And he's nearly 8. I was also able to heal my skin naturally, not once but twice. And the second time you guys saw it in real time. So now that I had this understanding or understanding of what the healthcare industry was, when the whole situation happened come 2020 that took over the whole globe, for me it was just like, is this a joke? Because I felt like I could literally see right through everything that was happening. I remember sometime in 2020 I did a video basically talking about, you know, the conspiracy behind, you know, the whole pandemic, and eventually they took it down because there was this whole operation where it's like if you were talking, you know, against, you know, what was going on, especially the injectables, you were silenced. I don't understand, to me, how that wasn't a red flag already, but anyway, that's none of my business. For me personally, because of my experiences in the healthcare industry, I felt like it was really a blessing in disguise, because when that whole thing happened, I could see it for what it was. But what kind of disturbed me, and kind of what set me on the trajectory that I kind of started on, and, you know, my exit out of the church, was seeing the church's response to what was going on globally with the pandemic. For me, because I was, you know, a Bible-believing Christian, for me it was like, it didn't matter what was going on, you know, health-wise or, you know, physically with people. I truly believe that we should have dealt with it in a biblical way, meaning that we wouldn't be fearful, we wouldn't be afraid, and we wouldn't be bullied by, you know, the government in regards to shutting the church doors, you know, adopting all of these protocols to make sure that, you know, sick people didn't come into the church. To me, that was backwards, because, you know, when I was reading my Bible and I'm seeing, you know, stories about, you know, the disciples and, you know, Paul and, you know, all of these other disciples that were able to heal people just by walking past them, or their shadows, or giving them handkerchiefs, I was like, what are we doing? Like, shouldn't we be able to, if we're talking about the same church and the same power, the same Holy Spirit that was on display, as they say, 2,000 years ago, why are we running away from the flu? That's how I saw it. And so I lost so much respect for the church, and not just the church that I was going to, but just the church as a whole, because everybody's response was pretty much the same. So anyway, the churches got shut, and during this time, that's when I really started to dig deep into my Bible, because I was like, this isn't making no sense. And for me, like, I've always been someone who's been really passionate about, like, end times and, you know, the book of Revelation, like, from the early onset, like, even before I got involved in the church that I was in, if that makes sense. And so I had a lot of understanding about the book of Revelation for myself. And again, for me, looking at what was going on with the whole pandemic situation, I felt like it was the onset of what people would refer to as, you know, end time prophecy, or, you know, the coming of the mark of the beast. And I'm not saying that, you know, what was rolled out is the mark of the beast, because it's not. But it was just like the system being set up, you know, the passes and the masking, and, you know, you not being able to go certain places unless you were cleared, and all of these things. To me, it just seemed very insane to me how the Bible in Revelation was able to describe to a T what the world would look like under this level of control. But yet when that level of control came, people were just going along with it as if they couldn't see anything. And to me, I was so disturbed. It was like the place that was supposed to be a place of sanctuary, or, you know, the place where, you know, we would be able to stand up and be able to champion, you know, what the Bible says and how to keep other people from, you know, going down the so-called road of destruction. They were in it. And I was just like, nah, I'm not involved. And so I started to research even more, started to get into my Bible deeper, into what the Bible said about end times, etc. My marriage was going through the worst of what I'd ever experienced. And I just want to pause here and just say, I'm going to assume that people that went to the church that I went to might watch this video. And I feel like a lot of people would be under the impression that I left the church because my marriage broke down. But if we skip back, again, those are for those people especially, because obviously if you don't know me, you wouldn't know. But my marriage started to break down, you know, prior to the onset of the whole COVID situation. And being the sort of person that I was, I felt like I gave myself to the gospel of Christ, or I gave myself to, you know, Jesus prior to me ever being married, prior to me ever really forming any solid relationships in the church. It was a personal decision I made for me. And I had made up my mind that whether I had a husband or not, whether my husband was in the church or not, I was going to be there. And so at the time that he kind of left, and he wasn't attending anymore, I was there because I didn't care. At the time, I was like, I'm riding out for this. Like, the gospel was literally everything to me. So I was like, whether he's here or not, I don't care. The whole COVID thing happened very soon after this whole turmoil kind of happened in my marriage. And so it was kind of all of a mishmash together. But whilst I was going through this upheaval in my relationship, the response to both issues at the same time to me were less than honourable and less than realistic, less than biblical. And the more I was starting to see the responses to these two things, it became apparent to me that although, these people were championing the Bible and championing the Word of God, they had no idea what it meant. The principles and, the wisdom behind the scriptures that they claim to believe. And, bit by bit, I could feel myself just drifting away. Not drifting away from, at the time, what I believed to be Christ, but just drifting away from the whole, just the church, because it just didn't make sense. It wasn't aligning. And the more I read my Bible, the more I started to realize that whatever you would call an institution was always going to be the furthest away from what Christ stood for, because he himself went against the very institutions of his own day. Does that make sense? So as I'm studying the Bible even more, I started to get into issues of the law, and I started to kind of veer towards that 7-day Adventism. I was in there for a little while, kind of reading and researching. And when I talk about this journey, when I think about this journey, to other people it might seem crazy, you don't even know what you're on, you don't know what you don't know what you believe, you're unstable. But listen to me when I say, that Spirit knows what Spirit is doing. Because if it wasn't for all of these transitions that I made, the end goal wouldn't have made any sense. My time in the 7-day Adventist church or 7-day Adventist beliefs taught me to study my Bible in a way I'd never studied it before. And I would always consider myself to be someone who was so studious. I'm someone who likes to research and read. I'm a reader. But these people taught me to study my Bible in a way that I'd never been taught to study it before. And so that principle of, line upon line, precept upon precept, helped me to understand what religion was by the time I got to that. Because I wasn't just reading my Bible in an isolated fashion. I was reading my Bible and lining it up with documented history, lining it up with maps, lining it up with world events, things that were documented, so it lined up. And if anything didn't line up, then I could see straight away something's not right here. And this is kind of how the journey really started. So I would say I was kind of dabbling in 7-day Adventism for probably about 6 months or whatever, and then I got involved in another group who had 7-day Adventist beliefs, but they weren't 7-day Adventists, because essentially a lot of the like I said, the main institutions, the main churches, no matter what it comes under, Catholicism, Baptist, Methodist, Pentecostalism, 7-day Adventists, they've all in some way, shape or form strayed away from what the founding beliefs systems are. And that's what I realized. And so the smaller group that I joined was okay, we're 7-day Adventists, but we're sticking to the original principles of whatever, Ellen G. White wrote about, or whatever the Bible principles were. But in this particular group, they were super strict. And so it was you couldn't have jewelry because jewelry was, demonic. You couldn't have fake hair and weave because that was demonic. You couldn't wear makeup because that was demonic. You couldn't wear trousers. You couldn't wear skirts that were above a certain length, I would say midi length. If it was too far above your ankles, it was demonic. And you couldn't wear anything that would be deemed, I would say, modern. And so I went into this almost what is the word I'm looking for? I don't know, when it comes to me I'll think of it. But it went even as deep as food. You weren't even allowed to eat certain foods. There was a list of foods that you were told not to eat. And I remember ginger being one of them, turmeric being one of them, basically a lot of spices. You were told not to eat spices because of this, that and the other. And again, because I consider myself to be someone who was devoted to the Word of God, if you could show it to me in the scripture and you could prove to me how this was biblical, then I would follow it. I would live by it. It went even deeper into music. You weren't allowed to listen to music that had drums in it, because the drums were demonic. And so we're going deeper and deeper. So anyway, I was involved in this group for about a year. Like I said, for me at the time, I was in it because I believed it was biblical. And it got to the point where, because I was researching so much alongside what I was reading in terms of history and maps and all sorts of different things, I started to realize that the documented history or the church history that has been documented didn't line up with historical events. So let's just to give you an example. Like I had learned basically that in church history, it started off with, say, the Roman Catholic Church. That was the institution of the Christian church, so to speak. And then, you know, there were different factions and different groups that came out of the Roman Catholic Church. So the Baptist Church was one, as I said, the Methodist Church was one. Then you had all these different churches that came out of the Roman Catholic Church. Now, in terms of history, we know that in England as well, that there were different groups of Christians, Protestants and Catholics. And the Protestant Church was said to be the movement where Protestants were protesting essentially against the Roman Catholic Church. And, you know, on paper, the Protestant movement was a movement that was trying to re-establish, you know, the base of the Bible, or the essence of what the Bible stood for in terms of wisdom, truth, principles, all of those things. Then when you look at documented history, so we look at, you know, the fact that the Protestants, you know, went through a lot of persecution in England. You know, there was a lot of, you know, hangings and a lot of crusades, murders of like people that went against the Roman Catholic Church for centuries. You know, on paper, it was documented, especially in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, that, you know, because of this wave of persecution that came against the Protestants, you know, that were protesting against the Catholic Church and the wickedness that they were doing, that they set sail to the Americas basically to find refuge and to, you know, go somewhere and, you know, start over again where they're able to practice their biblical traditions or their biblical principles without persecution. But we know from history that the Americas is where essentially slavery took place and slavery happened. And so as I'm looking at this and I'm reading it in, you know, in biblical terms, in historical terms, I'm like, this doesn't make sense. As we'd say today, like the math wasn't mathing. So you're telling me that the Protestants in this country who were being persecuted and were being, you know, brutally murdered by, you know, the Roman Catholic Church and, you know, their practices, went to America and then began to enslave Black and Indigenous people. It just wasn't making sense. And all of these things were really spinning my head. So I started to like really double down and start to look at some of these things. I started to look at the writings of Ellen G. White, who, as I said, was supposed to, is the so-called prophet of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Looking at her writings and, you know, the things that she would talk about, you know, in reference to Black people or Indigenous people. And I started to realize that a lot of her writings were actually very, very racist. And I was just like, what in the actual world is going on? So when I started to bring this up to the group that I was fellowshipping with, you know, everything I was saying, just similarly to, you know, when I brought up a lot of the issues that I had with the church that I was going to, I was, you know, bringing forth, you know, a whole list of questions, you know, a whole list of, you know, things that didn't match up, you know, historically with, you know, the accounts of the church. And it was rejected and rebuffed every single time. It was like, every time I brought up something, would be like, oh no, but this is that, and this is this. And it got to the point where I realized that in each and every one of these institutions, no matter what they believe, you can bring as many facts as you want to these people. If it doesn't align with what it is that they believe and they teach, they will literally discard you. They will literally throw you away. And for me, like with this group, it wasn't that deep. But I would say when I left the church that I'd been going to or fellowshipping with for 12 years, it was so painful for me to have gone through this whole experience or this whole journey of what I would call Christianity with people that claim to be my family, people that claim to, you know, love me and respect me as, you know, as a person, as a woman of God, so to speak. And because now our belief systems no longer align, it was like, okay, cool, on to the next one. Again, it was just that realization that the Bible that most of these people claim to follow is just lip service. It's very far and few between that you will find, you know, Christian or people that profess to be Christians actually living a biblical life. And the ones that are usually the ones that leave, because eventually you start to realize not only the discrepancies between scripture and practices, but also the fact that no one else is actually living what they claim to believe. So anyway, I came out of this group that I was fellowshipping with, and I just started to like really go down into the rabbit hole of, you know, Christianity, where it started, its inception, How did it come about? Where did it come from? And that took me into, I don't even know what to describe it as, because I don't want to say Hebrew Israelite, because I didn't fully get immersed into that whole culture. But one thing I would say is that as I was reading my Bible for myself, it became very apparent to me that the Old Testament was a document of African culture and practices in every sense of the word. African culture in regards to marriage, in regards to community, in regards to childbirth and child rearing, in regards to even the miracles, or the things that they would do in the Old Testament that we would deem to be miracles, that if we were to do them today, in sight of anyone or everyone, it would be deemed as witchcraft. If I was to walk on water, somebody would call me a witch. And so it started to just dawn on me that, the Old Testament is without a doubt African culture, but how did we get from African culture, practices, beliefs to what we see today, or being practiced as Christianity today in the Western world? And that's when I started to make these correlations and realize that, a lot of what we call Christianity, or what we deem to be, religion, is really just a theft of African and indigenous cultures and practices that have been repurposed and sold back to you with a European mind. I'm going to say it again. What we call religion today is just a theft, a colonized version of African spiritual practices and culture, repurposed and sold back to you with a European face and mind. So for a period of time, I started to believe that, the children of Israel were not the people or the group of people that live in Israel today, but they were actually, African people, or more specifically Bantu people that live all over the continent. And so I was still very much, following the Bible and living by biblical principles. And this was probably for like a year, I would say. But again, reading the Bible, looking at history together, there were so many things that weren't marrying up. And I think it got to what really triggered it for me, or what really set it off for me, was reading the biblical account of, what happened in Egypt when the children of Israel were leaving Egypt. And, given this description of Egypt as being, like a wicked and evil people who had enslaved the children of Israel. First of all, there is no documented history of that ever taking place. And second of all, I was introduced to a document called the 42 Laws of Ma'at, which is, I'll leave a link to it below so you can have a read if you want to read it. But essentially, it was a list of laws that the ancient Egyptians lived by. You very quickly realize that even though we've been taught by the Bible being the only source of this civilization that was apparently wicked and pagan and anti-God and anti the children of Israel, were actually in fact probably the greatest civilization that the world has ever known, simply because they stood upon this foundation called the 42 Laws of Ma'at as principles to live by in their community. And when you read this document, you also realize that number one, the 42 Laws of Ma'at are older than the Old Testament, and the 10 Commandments are again taken from the 42 Laws of Ma'at. And so I'm looking at this and I'm like, this is not making sense. Like, how can we be, under the impression or under the belief that the Egyptians were wicked when it's very, very well documented that the ancient Egyptians is the greatest civilizations that the earth has ever seen? That even up until this day that I'm speaking to you in 2024, there are things that the ancient Egyptians knew and did that till this day we still can't figure out how they knew or had all that information. It really spun me to the point where I didn't know what to believe anymore. In all honesty, I was deeply confused, deeply rattled, and I was like, no, I need to make sense of this. So when I started to compare different African cultures and ancient practices, as I said, I'd already figured out that the Old Testament was ancient African culture. But when I started to compare and contrast different cultures across the African continent, I started to realize that what we would call Egypt today, in that small northern country in Africa today, is not what ancient Egypt was thousands of years ago. That ancient Egypt or ancient Kemet really encompassed the whole of the African continent, because the country lines that we have today were instituted by Europeans. Again, you can Google this, I'll leave a link below, but you can research about the Berlin Conference, or what's also known as the Congo, the Congo Conference, where all of these European countries came together and they literally butchered up Africa and took pieces of Africa for themselves. Up until that point, Africa was functioning as a whole landmass with no divisions, which is why you can go to Africa today and you will find Akan speaking people, which is my tribe, or the tribe of my mother, not just in Ghana, but in Ivory Coast and Togo. Because when they created these country lines across the continent, they didn't take into account the tribes that were living across areas over large land masses in Africa. They just cut the lines wherever they wanted to and then named them however they wanted to name them. And this ancient Egyptian culture that encompassed majority of the African continent was known as the Nile Valley civilization. And again, that's another point of reference that you guys can research for yourself. The key to bringing all of this together is in the languages. African languages as a whole are so important because it holds not just culture, but it also holds memory. And so when I came to, naming this channel or naming my brand, the reason why I called it Abatum is because it means melanin. And again, when I spoke to my mom about it and spoke to different people about it, there are even like Tree-speaking people that have never heard of the word Abatum before. But when you break it down, it has a meaning, which we'll get into in another video. But there's so many hidden gems, hidden wisdom, and hidden knowledge in our very languages that if we were to learn them, speak them, and get down to the etymology of all of these languages, we will realize that we're very much one people, one civilization. And it was the Europeans that came in, not only colonized us, but created divisions across us all over the world. So anyway, for a long period of time, as I said, I was feeling so lost and confused. I didn't even know what to believe anymore. And I was going through like this really dark period of just being lost, like just not having a sense of self, not having any bearings, not knowing what to believe, not knowing like what to consume or what to even believe as information. But I said to myself, I prayed about this like earnestly, and I was like, you know what, God, Spirit, like speak to me in a way I will understand, in a way this makes sense. Tie this all in for me in a way that makes sense. And I decided to put the Bible down for a short period and just look into my culture, as in my Akan culture, my Ghanaian culture. The amazing thing about this whole experience is that whilst I was going through all of this, my closest friend, or one of my closest friends, was literally going through the exact same experience with me. It was like I didn't have to force her. And even at one point, especially when I was involved in this, this 7-day Adventist group, we kind of went like two separate ways, but we stayed just as close as we were before. It's like we never became separated from each other. So whilst I was going through my journey, she was going through hers. And whenever I would learn something, I'll share it with her. Whenever she learned something, she would share it with me. And it's like we were always kind of like feeding and kind of bouncing off each other, till we both got to the point where we realized that we were going through exactly the same thing, and we eventually came to exactly the same conclusion. So I started to research African culture, African cultural beliefs like Ifa, which is from the Yoruba people, Akom, which is from the Akan people of Ghana, Vodun, which is from the Ewe people of Ghana, and also the Fon people, looking into the Dogon of Mali, all of these different cultures, the cosmology of the Congo people in the Democratic Republic of Congo and Congo. It came together in such a way that I realized that all of these cosmologies were the same. The principles were the same. The wisdom was the same, and the essence of all of these were the same. But it wasn't religion, how we've been taught religion in the Western world. It was essentially a sacred science. Again, going back to this idea of holistic health and holistic practices. There is no compartmentalization of anything when it comes to African culture. Everything is one. There is an all in all. And when we think of God, how we've been taught again in the Western world, it's like God is like this separate entity, that dictates all of these things that we need to obey. These are the 10 commandments. You need to obey this and this and that. But God is all in all. God, like the essence of God, I don't even like to say the word God, because God, I feel like, is even too small. It's in everything. It encompasses everything. One thing that I would say that all of these things have in common is that every single one of these African ancient practices has been demonized by the West to be demonic, witchcraft, evil, primitive. And when I started to really dig into, each of these practices and, the foundation, the principles that they all reside upon, I realized that they were more righteous, they were more good, and that they were more beneficial to us as people than Christianity has ever been in its whole entire history. The reason why they needed to demonize it the way that they did, and the reason why they needed to class all of these ancient practices as primitive and demonic, is because they needed to strip it from you in order to colonize you. They needed to strip it from you in order to give you something that would make you subservient to them. And again, I'm making these statements, but as we go through these videos on this channel, I'm gonna go through everything bit by bit by bit. And without a question of a doubt, that every single practicing religion, as long as you can deem it an Abrahamic religion, it was only forced upon you in order to colonize you. And I know there are people watching this video that might say, oh no, but Christianity has its roots in Africa, and it was actually Africans that brought Christianity to the world. And they talk about Christianity having its roots in Ethiopia. I feel like that's another topic that we need to go into in another video, because a lot of our history has been falsified. A lot of our history has been erased. A lot of our history has been dictated to us by the people who colonized us. And so if it's not looked at from the lens of reality, then it will never truly make sense. It's always going to contradict until you go back to your own culture, until you go back to your sense of self. It's always going to contradict. It doesn't make any sense. And when you start to realize how, this African and indigenous culture was stolen by Europeans in order to create all three Abrahamic religions, it will not make sense. It will not make sense. Anyway, so as I said, as I've gone through this process and, gone back into my culture and truly understood, what these sacred sciences are, I don't call it religion, and I even very rarely call it spirituality. I refer to them as sacred sciences because that's what describes them, in the best way possible. Everything that's practiced in African and indigenous cultures can actually be proven by scientific methods today. That's when I realized how spirituality, wellness, and science were so closely connected. And again, I am literally so excited to, go on this journey with you and teach you all that I've learned in such a way that it makes sense. I'm not doing this just to discredit people's faith or beliefs. I'm doing this because I understand how important it is for people to come to a knowledge of self in order to make themselves well. Anyway, if you've got any questions, by all means, hit me up in the comments below and I'll answer your questions. I'm gonna do as much as I can to put as many links, videos, or whatever is relative to this video in the comments. But yeah, I guess I'll see you in the next video.